Hello, my name is David McCurrach. I'm a university lecturer working in Japan, and the title of my presentation is Zipfian Distribution and Corpus Frequency Data, Assessing Language Authenticity in English Textbooks and Strategies for Vocabulary Retention. So first, let me give an outline of this presentation. I'll first go over the context in Japan, which is within junior high schools. I'll talk about the MEXT guidelines, MEXT being the governmental department that oversees education and gives recommendations to English learning. I'll talk about Zipf's law and vocabulary frequency, then go over some corpus data and rankings of vocabulary. Then I'll talk about the findings from some junior high school textbooks that I used. Then I'll talk about some problems with vocabulary retention and finally give some learning strategies. So first, let me give you some context. So we're talking about Japanese junior high schools. There are 3 levels, so first, second and third years. Students are aged between 12 to 15. English is studied 4 times a week. Each lesson is about 50 minutes, with one lesson being with a native English speaking teacher. In general, though, the educational system is rooted in Confucianism and American-led World War II reforms, which is an interesting dichotomy, but it does mean that typically exams are front and center, and this leads to a lot of rote learning, in other words, sort of copying and repeating, and it leaves little room for creativity. MEXT, which is the Ministry of Education, Sports, Science and Technology, determines the state school English curriculum in Japan. It's stated that by the end of the 3rd year in junior high school, students should know approximately 900 English words. However, immediately we're faced with questions pertaining as to how and where such a number originated, since a public list detailing the exact approved words could not be located. And it's important to understand how authentic the chosen words are. So, according to Kilgarif, somewhere beyond around 160,000 words, English dictionaries have trouble defining more obscure vocabulary. And the typical native English speaker is unlikely to know more than a fifth of these, but the gap in knowledge compared to a second language learner is vast, and probably the most significant difference between the groups. Actually, Lawfer estimated that an English speaker might know around 18,000 root words, compared to around 3,500 to around 4,000 for an upper intermediate English high school learner. In addition to these figures, though, there's problems arising for language learners in terms of choosing which vocabulary to learn and in what order and how to learn them. So word frequency revealed from an appropriate body of written or spoken text is called a corpus. And this can greatly aid the learning process because there's lots of useful data that can be gleaned from them. In such case, lemma, which are root or family words, are often listed, and they encompass a range of conjugations, contractions, and other forms. So one such corpus is the Canco corpus, the Cambridge and Nottingham corpus of discourse data. And it's a 5 million word database of transcribed conversations. It gives a clear indication of how frequency declines with obscurity, as identified by McCarthy. This steep and continual decline is highly noteworthy because uncommon words become rarer and rarer on a linear and sharp decline. In a manual positioned as an English learning guide, Nation reports that 100 of the most common words cover about 50% of the most written or spoken texts. 1,000 words covers 80%, while 5,000 words covers 98%. So this pattern falls under Zipf's law, which is a fascinating mathematical distribution model made popular by George Kingsley Zipf. It states that the frequency rank of the highest ranking item is proportional to the second having twice the appearances as the third, and the third having 3 times the occurrences of the fourth, and so on in a linear fashion. What it leads to is a large disparity between common and uncommon words. You can see in this graph that the probability is inversely correlated to the rank, and it drops off very, very quickly at the beginning. Of course, the subject matter is relevant to the frequency of words. So like a family film such as Shrek, you would need knowledge of approximately 4,000 lemma to achieve a 98% comprehension rate, while a high-level novel might need around 9,000 words to achieve the same comprehension rate. However, McCarthy notes that the first 2,000 frequent words might cover the majority of the core vocabulary needed for everyday use. So why is this relevant? Well, in more recent times, a number of scholars such as Kilgareth, Nation and McCarthy suggest choosing vocabulary by performing a systematic analysis of English text. In doing so, one can identify the most frequently occurring words and choose vocabulary accordingly. Kilgareth in particular observes that more common words should be taught to foreign learners first, both so that they understand them and so that they know how to and are inclined to use them. This is crucial to achieving learning efficiency, especially at beginner levels in Japanese junior high schools, where English at the first grade is observed by myself to be taught assuming no prior knowledge. Therefore, textbooks should logically introduce vocabulary that are taught roughly in line with Zipfian distribution, as in, the most common words should be taught first for the highest learning efficiency. Well, let's look at some of the frequency ranking data. You can download data from the Kanko corpus and see the rankings of 60,000 lemmas taken from 1 billion words. As a reminder, lemma are the sort of pre-conjugation, family or root words. So something like decided, deciding and decides would fall under the decide lemma. They're a mixture of written and spoken English and therefore a pretty comprehensive representation of authentic language. You can see that unsurprisingly, prepositions, conjunctions and pronouns form the vast majority of the most common words, followed by basic verbs. I used to work as an assistant language teacher, or ALT, in a junior high school in Osaka. And in this context, students receive one 15-minute lesson with the ALT to engage in English activities in cooperation with the Japanese English teachers, and 3 lessons with the Japanese English teacher alone. The textbook I used to use in all lessons is a series called New Horizon English Course, and this is a MEXT approved series with a lexical foundation based on American English. Combining all 3 books, which encompasses the 3 years of Japanese junior high school, a total of 969 combined listed words were counted, which comprised of bolded vocabulary deemed important to learn. This thus falls within MEXT approximate 900 word guideline. Let's look at some of the findings then. I compared the required vocabulary from New Horizon to the COCA corpus. The vocabulary in New Horizon are arranged alphabetically and appear as lemma, thus making them ideal for comparison to the corpus. Verbs were chosen in particular due to their postulated regular incidence rates compared to other lexical items. They're displayed in addition to the COCA lemma ranking beside each, and you can see a sample here. There are some key discrepancies that are worth noting here. Although most of the verbs fall within what McCarthy has described as part of the 2000 core vocabulary, there are some that don't fall within that range. Firstly, in terms of yearly progression and in terms of frequency ranking, it seems to be quite erratic and non-linear. There are words in the first year textbook like cook that are ranked 1426, while in the second year introduces verbs like excuse, which is ranked 3514. Furthermore, many verbs also fall considerably out of the 900 range, suggesting that MEXT might not have based their approved list from foreign corpora. Seemingly corroborating this data in a much more comprehensive study, Rue conducted an analysis of second-year Japanese junior high school students that had completed 2 textbooks. The study was undertaken in order to ascertain not just the number of words known, but also the depth of knowledge and the usefulness of the words themselves. She compared their knowledge to a 1,000 most common word list from Nation, which itself is based on the British National Corpus and the Coca Corpus. The study found that while students' vocabulary range was sufficient, their understanding of the individual words was low. Additionally, the vocabulary in the books was often shown to be low to medium frequency. Well, why is this? Well, Japanese textbooks like New Horizon might be showing vocabulary targeting more written language because of the exam-focused and low communicative nature of EFL instruction, as suggested by McKinley. Brown suggests many English textbooks put too much emphasis on form and meaning and neglect other areas of vocabulary knowledge, especially in terms of how often individual vocabulary occurs. Another potential reason for the irregularity in frequency is that what MEX perceives as necessary vocabulary may be a result of cultural and regional variation. For example, certain words like swim might have a higher usage incidence in the Japanese language because swimming might be a more popular activity. However, this postulation will require more thorough research, however. Finally, I'd like to briefly go over the difficulties of learning vocabulary and some learning strategies. Nation and Mira stressed that in addition to the usefulness of individual vocabulary items, the needs of learners must also be considered. Vocabulary teaching has been said to be one of the most neglected parts of language learning in Japan, with some teachers expecting students to do this by themselves. Although not an altogether unreasonable request, some students might require more instruction in learning methods than others. Wang observes that foreign language learners simply do not have enough encounters with unknown words in enough contexts. And Japanese junior high school students in particular have little time. In fact, more than 60% attend cram schools after school in evenings and weekends. A further constraint language learners encounter is that when lexis is very unlike their native language, progress can be substantially hindered. Nation refers to this as a learning burden. For example, Japanese junior high school students will likely have more trouble learning English vocabulary than they would a language with a more similar orthographic system such as Chinese. Schmidt mentions this as a cognitive factor of developmental sharpening of word form, whereby a student is so accustomed to their native language processing that it causes the second language processing to become more problematic. As a result of these difficulties and other situational factors, anxiety, demotivation, and frustration can manifest in students, thus impeding their language learning potential. Learning strategies, then, are crucial not only to successful vocabulary retention, but learner success in general. To this effect, considerable research and debate about vocabulary learning strategies exist and continue to evolve. One of the most influential taxonomies divides the vocabulary acquisition process into 2 types. Ellis established a learning continuum which specifies that learner strategies are either implicit, which is like being incidental, or explicit, which is like being conscious. The former may also be termed as meaning-focused input or deliberate learning. Essentially, learners are either focused on word forms through conscious study or absorbing them by chance exposure, such as through media, and picking up vocabulary from daily life without noticing. While some scholars argue that overuse of such explicit vocabulary learning techniques should be discouraged, more recent scholars support the case for more explicit vocabulary learning. This is because one of the largest drawbacks of implicit learning is that it is extremely slow. Lowther observed that to ensure 108 words are learnt incidentally with a minimum repetition of 10 times each, a student would have to read as many as 200,000 words of text. This is already assuming that students have nation's ideal 95 to 98% comprehension rate, and thus it is quite an unrealistic strategy for low-level junior high school students in Japan. However, after a thorough analysis of vocabulary learning strategies, Schmidt discerns more succinctly that virtually anything that leads to more exposure, attention, manipulation, or time spent on lexical items adds to their learning. Anything that leads to more and better engagement should improve vocabulary learning. Thus, repeated explicit exposure to target vocabulary through engaging methods, knowledge retention ought to improve. So in a Japanese junior high school classroom, this might include things like word matching worksheets, intensive and speed reading, semantic mapping, word detective activities, and simply repeating words aloud. Outside of the classroom, however, the use of flashcards is a very common retention technique, usually achieved through word pair memorization. Vocabulary exposure learning that has a user study their second language words and attempt to recall the native language meaning is known as receptive learning. The opposite, when studying their native language words with the goal to recall the second language word meaning, is termed productive learning. Webb's Japanese study of decontextualized receptive and productive strategies involving flashcards found that both were effective. However, while productive learners gained greater knowledge of orthography, meaning, syntax, and grammar, receptive learners scored higher in the meaning metric. The assertion we can draw is that both receptive and productive strategies should be employed during flashcard utilization. Productive and receptive flashcard learning would be bolstered by scheduling where new vocabulary words should be learnt and revisited, known as spaced repetition. In terms of cognition, Ellis calls this part of a cognitive spacing effect, noting that revisiting vocabulary items in intervals is about twice as effective as studying vocabulary lists. This is called massed learning. A systematic use of paper flashcards like this is effective, but it requires schedule management, self-monitoring, and is inefficient if easier words are studied too often or harder words are not studied enough. This is where computer-assisted language learning can help mitigate these problems. So in a Japanese junior high school classroom, occasional PC lab use, where students used spaced repetition flashcard software based on their textbooks, would be the ultimate vocabulary retention strategy. So, what can we conclude? Zipfian distribution in the context of English vocabulary suggests that learning via frequency is the most efficient means. Ranking of word frequency from corpus data can illustrate how closely textbooks use authentic language. The New Horizon book studied shows some evidence of rank-based word choice, with irregularities possibly owing to cultural variation, and the prevalence of exams leading to an emphasis of focusing on written English, which may skew the results. This is all interesting but irrelevant if students do not retain vocabulary. Exposure of any kind is the most important, but efficiency is key. In that respect, both implicit and explicit learning strategies necessary for vocabulary retention are important, and spaced repetitions are probably the most effective. Thank you very much for listening to the presentation. I'll list my references on the following slides.